Angelus Domine non viat Maria, et concepti de Spiritus Sanctum, Ave Maria, grate plene. Almost on cue, the iron bell of St. Justine began to ring the 6 a.m. Angelus. I had beaten it by a mere 10 seconds. Esse ancile Domine, fiat mihi, sectum verbedum tum, Ave Maria, grate plene. I pulled back the comforter and sat up, resting my feet on the warm wooden floor. The sky was dark, but seemed to be slowly lightening up with each second as the sun raced on its steady track. Et verbum caro factum est, et habitabit in nobis, Ave Maria, grate plene. I stood up, stretching as I concluded the Angelus prayer, always my first of the day. Warmth of the floor inevitably meant CK had started a fire in the wood stove. I made my way downstairs to see if I could return the favor by fixing our breakfast. I was in luck to accomplish my good deed, as I could see CK sitting in the living room next to the lively roaring fire, half dozing off while reading a book. I chuckled to myself as I debated waking him, but figured the smell of a good breakfast would be a more pleasing way to wake up than your associate exorcist tapping you on the shoulder. I made my way to the kitchen and started working on the great bulwark of all breakfastum: bacon, eggs, potatoes, with a lot of coffee to boot. Father Kelly and I had been working together for about a month at this point. The fervor of my arrival had abated, with the case of the possessed man in Chinatown I had associated with being my hit so far. There had been a few investigations in the time since, interviews and the like, including the rather ominous note which I described at the end of the previous tale. But, as is often the case, they turned out to be easily explainable. An emotive Italian grandmother, convinced her pantry was being destroyed by the devil, turned out to be a nest of rats. A young college student who had seemingly lost the will to live, and whose parents noticed fresh injuries on him every morning, turned out to be just a case of clinical depression. We even investigated a series of frantic messages left on the church's answering machine, and realized they were coming from a psychiatric care home for schizophrenia, by a man who claimed to be Jesus, who just needed a little help exorcising his live-in nurse. Each of these cases certainly merited prayers and mass intentions on our part, and a referral to someone else, be it a doctor or an exterminator, but certainly not an exorcist. And it occurred to me that sometime in the space of that month, there was a clear logic in keeping an exorcist involved in normal parish ministry. Staying grounded in normal pastoral ministry genuinely seemed to refresh CK between cases. His relationship with the members of the parish was genuine, a stellar example of real spiritual fatherhood, which priests are supposed to embody. I began to realize that many of the parishioners had some story to tell about CK, how he had encountered them in different circumstances, and somehow changed their lives for the better, but they hadn't quite gotten around to giving me the details of those stories. However, I was most excited by how welcoming everyone had been to me so far. As those thoughts stirred through my head, I recalled another feeling which had been steadily growing since I woke up. I felt like today, an otherwise beautiful Saturday morning, was going to bring another investigation with it. The night before, CK had received a phone call from the chantry, the office where the bishop works, for those unfamiliar. I figured it might be mundane parish matters, but I saw CK put on his serious face quite quickly. That usually only came out when he needed to take in details from a potential case, a tell I had learned pretty early on. Before taking the rest of the call in his private study, he simply told me, "You might want to turn in early." My contemplation was interrupted by the sound of CK's footsteps coming into the kitchen. He looked a bit disheveled from his nap in the chair, but otherwise rested. "Smells like a feast of heaven on earth in here," he said, his voice excited. "Oh, indeed. Come to the table of plenty," I said. He chuckled and sat down as I poured him the first fruits of the coffee pot, and set a plate in front of him adorned with crispy bacon, over-easy eggs, and fried potatoes. I did the same for myself and joined him at the table, providing the blessing for our feast before we dug in. "I suppose you'll be wanting the news?" CK plainly asked, crunching down on a slice of bacon. I laughed as I sipped coffee. "I'm all ears." Business was no cause for CK slowing down, as he recounted our newest assignment between bites of food. "Yesterday's call was from the bishop himself, surprisingly." I was taken aback. Normally a case call would come from his assistant in the chantry, the vicar general, or some old deacon doing office work in his retirement. CK, of course, could seemingly read my thoughts by the look on my face.
That's right, kid. It's looking like it might be the real deal. Bizarre case details, too. Apparently, the Chantry's been getting near endless phone calls for a few days from Lavender McCoy.
Seeing the confusion on my face, he stopped for a moment.
I keep forgetting you knew. Lavender McCoy owns Lavender's Esoterica, one of those shops that sells crystals and shit to alternative kids trying to find their inner sun goddess.
I tried unsuccessfully to stifle a chuckle.
But, despite the vast majority of her clientele being made up of that sort, she does cater to a genuine occult interest as well. I'm not sure how much stock she really puts in all of it, but anyone around here dealing with the occult and needing supplies, herbs and books and the like, they all go to her.
So, she's had some change of heart?
Now, hang on a second. I'm still in the middle of a story. So last night, the bishop is walking back to his residence at the cathedral when who does he see waiting at his door but Lavender McCoy, and not exactly in a change of heart mood either.
She wasn't trying to start something, was she?
No, nothing like that. She was distraught, actually. Said through gritted teeth that she normally wouldn't give a damn to speak 2 words to me. Her words, of course, but there wasn't nobody else that she felt could approach this. Well, suffice to say, it was something in our purview. That's about it.
I paused for a moment. So, nothing else? No case information?
Of course not. CK rolled his eyes as he finished his last bite of eggs. God knows why she went all the way to the middle of downtown to harass the bishop. Her little tchotchke shop is just down the way, and we've run into each other more than once.
What are we supposed to do then?
On the rare occasion that the bishop himself has to pass something on to me directly, he likes to play a little game of detective. Never gives me a word about the case itself, has me investigate the claimant, get the story, and then compare it with his own reports to see if it matches before anything gets rolling. Apparently, putting 1 extra cog in the paperwork machine is his price for being bothered.
CK stood up, giving me a firm pat on the shoulder as he walked his dishes over to the sink.
Get your uniform on, Gray. We're heading out to Lavender's Esoterica.
As we closed the formidable front door of the rectory, the sun had just come over the horizon to illuminate an uncharacteristically warm October morning. Though urban, the neighborhood which St. Justine's occupies was a few blocks short of any particularly tall buildings, meaning that we were always able to bask in that initial morning glory. Another benefit of our location was that driving was only a factor in some cases, which took us beyond our, or rather CK's, walking ability. Though elderly, he was quite spry, and for as short a trip as this was, he had balked the recommendation of a car. Lavender's store was about half an hour away on foot, and CK insisted that we walk it, for his health, of course. In seminary, we had often received admonitions for wearing clerical attire in public. Certainly some of the older clergy were averse to it, because it wasn't welcoming the thoughts of a particular generation, but even some of the younger instructors maintained that it could get us targeted for harassment, or simply made an open book for solicitation by riffraff. The sight of a priest in clerical attire, never mind the distinctive cassock, had been a rarity for some decades. CK, of course, was insistent on it.
A flock needs to see their shepherd, he would say to me,
and to see him they did. He wore the same black cassock as I did, but carried a gentlemanly old-world touch with it, a black and silver walking stick, which he certainly didn't need, and a fine black Tyrolean hat. Despite his discouraged manner of dress, CK certainly made a good reputation for himself in the neighborhood. Though in a poorer area of town, and certainly not bustling with Catholics, the few people we encountered walking the streets or sitting on their stoops greeted him by name.
CK, what's good, my man? Father, and another father. Say they ain't gonna put you out to pasture, are they? Morning, Padre. It was somewhat inspiring, if a bit amusing to say the least.
CK's mood was contemplative as we walked. He was usually like this just prior to a visitation, mulling about the possibilities and calling on high for some aid. I tried to do the same, but this all being new to me, I found myself continuously distracted by my own worries. It had been weeks since my harrowing encounter at the apartment across the city, but I could not shake the experience. These things had gone from being hypotheticals in my head, things which I certainly believed but had never experienced, to being as real as the autumn sun currently bearing down on us. How, I thought to myself, am I supposed to fit this into my normal life? Lost in thought, I had hardly noticed as the buildings began to occupy more and more space. Before us, I could see the cityscape still some distance away, with buildings slowly reaching further into the heavens as they approached downtown. CK came to a stop and pointed catty-corner to us, where, among various other storefronts, was an exotic-looking shop bedecked with Gothic decor. The white lettering on the large window read, "Lavender's Esoterica." Inside, I could barely make out the figure of a woman sitting at a table near the window, drinking out of a mug and looking out at us. "Saves us the trouble of waking her up, I suppose," CK whispered. "Let's not keep her waiting, then. Gray, this woman may just be putting her toes in the water, but she's involved in some very serious business, even if she doesn't entirely know it. She's also a rather unique individual. Let me lead here, okay?" CK began walking across the street with an energetic purpose, taking off his hat and handing it back to me as I caught up. The door of the shop opened just as we stepped onto the sidewalk, and Lavender McCoy walked out. She was a woman in her mid-30s, it seemed, and evenly proportioned. Her hair was jet black with streaks of purple dyed in, matching what appeared to be the remnants of makeup on her exhausted face. "Lavender, Father Gray and I are here to follow up on your discussion with Bishop Joseph." She gave me a very obvious once-over, her tone filling with skepticism. "Young Father Gray at that. If it weren't for the hair, I'd say he was trying to skip class at Holyrood Academy by pretending to be a priest." "You know me," CK responded with an air of humor, "always trying to help the needy." Lavender gave a faint smile. "Yes, I do know you, which is precisely why I wanted to avoid getting you involved. If word gets out that you're in my shop for more than a few minutes, most of my regulars are going to think I've baptized their tarot cards. Probably best if we come inside then, lest anyone get the wrong idea." Lavender sighed and ushered us in, locking the door behind us and drawing the few curtains she had. Inside of Lavender's Esoterica, you could smell the faint aroma of incense, though not exactly the variety one might use at Mass. It was earthy and herbal, with the old wood of the building and the shelves of books providing its own unique musk. She had an assortment of occult and New Age goods on display, beautiful rocks and gems, crystals of all varieties, charms, hunks of herbs, the aforementioned shelves of books. A few tables and chairs lay scattered around the room, including one with a decorative crystal ball. As Lavender arranged a few chairs just out of view of the window, she noticed my curious glance. "Looking to take up scrying in your spare time?" I looked back at her, catching the faint smirk on her face. Even CK seemed to take some amusement from the question, literally anticipating her behavior. Somehow the realization that I was indeed a priest standing around an occult shop managed to suddenly befuddle me. "Just appreciating your, ball." "Young Father Gray is still rather new to the field. I haven't quite gotten him as far as the mechanics of your esoterica." Lavender laughed, pulling out a final chair for me and motioning me to sit down. "Not sure that I buy the scrying, but it brings in the clients for Madame Dobroska's clairvoyance every Wednesday." Lavender's face suddenly became serious. "Seances with the dead every Friday, too." She broke into a laugh, seeming to reveal how uncomfortable I probably appeared. CK seemed able to see through the facade of humor and got right to the point. "Lavender, I know something is troubling you. I can see you're exhausted. We're not here to cast any judgment on your store or your craft or your clients. We just want to help." CK looked over at me. Taking a cue, I reassured her. "Miss Lavender, please, tell us what happened." Lavender took a deep breath, biting her lip for a moment before recounting her story. "I thought if I went to the bishop, he could do something himself.
Anyone raised Catholic knows when you want something actually done, the bishop is the one you talk to. I noticed a curious pensiveness come over CK's face for a moment. I told him this whole story, and he told me he'd have someone look into it, but that I needed to go to the police as well. But I'm not doing that. Not to someone else. The same look. Regret, maybe? I couldn't place what this emerging dynamic was. Lavender took another deep breath, her voice taking on a slightly trembling quality as she continued. A few weeks ago, a new man came into the shop. He was nice enough, very interested in demonology and some other particular interests. Asked for some book recommendations. Something about him, though. I knew he wasn't looking for the mass market stuff that I peddle to college students. I took him to the back, where I keep more valuable materials. At the end of the day, he made a sizable purchase, plus a few obscure spell books and some other supplies, candles and herbs and the like. Nothing out of the ordinary. He just seemed like any other guy in the community. CK pulled out a small notebook and pen from his cassock, beginning to write as Lavender spoke. Every few days he came in, speaking with me. Something about him was just, I don't know, charming. He wasn't exactly a looker, but there was something about him that just clicked with me. After a week, he invited me to get a cup of coffee, and I accepted. It was a perfectly good time, even if the conversation kept going over the same subjects I work with day in and day out. He seemed knowledgeable and approachable. After an hour had gone by, we finally went our separate ways, but he suddenly asked if dinner might be out of the question. I told him I'd think about it, but even then, I wanted to accept. The intense scribblings from CK were audible. I tried to listen as sharply as possible to capture my own version of her tale. A few days later, that would be around 4 days ago, he came back into the shop. He spoke again at the counter. Good conversation. But at a certain point, his mood shifted. Not in a bad way, just intensely. This feeling came over me, a tingling almost, an energetic charge. Sounds rich coming from someone doubtful about all this in the first place. She gave an exasperated laugh, seemingly to relieve the anxiety which grew in her with every moment of the retelling. He looked into my eyes with this intensity and said such beautiful things about me, that I was special, that I had a gift. I noticed CK had stopped writing and was looking up at Lavender, one eyebrow cocked. After a moment, he looked down and continued writing. He said that from the moment he saw me, he knew that he could help me hone my ability to genuinely come into my own. Normally, I'd just dismiss that along with the other New Age whack that people try to say to me, but it felt so different coming from him. It felt real. She paused for a moment. "What did he ask you to do?" CK inquired. "He just asked me out to dinner again. Said we could go to his place after I closed. I couldn't find it in myself to say no. Of course, I had to accept. He was just... Perfect for you?" I asked. Lavender nodded. I could see her eyes becoming dewed. After I closed that night, he met me and we just started walking to his place. We didn't even converse that much. I just felt like I was on autopilot. We walked down the street aimlessly. How long, I don't know. It seemed like a fog came over my mind and my sense of direction. Even the normal lights of the city seemed to make way for the real fog, which became darker. Finally, I found myself in front of some random house. Nothing special, but somehow it was in the city. Or who knows where it actually was. I didn't really have a clue where we had gone, really. Tears finally came, slowly trickling out of the sides of her eyes, stained by the faint remnants of her eyeliner. He invited me in, and... CK looked at her intently, almost mad with sobriety. "What was in the house, Ezra?" "Ezra?" I thought, my mind racing with confusion. Lavender buried her face in her hands, audibly crying. Bodies, father. Dead, decaying, laid out like some kind of like a sacrifice, all on wooden altars. The heads, oh God, their heads. Father, they were on the corners of the altar, 4 of them, all women. My heart was racing, threatening to beat out of my chest. And in the room, somehow beyond what I could see, but still there all the same, I don't know, something evil and monstrous, several feet tall and robed in black hoods, with faces made of horrific animal skulls, dripping with blood, holding knives in bony, bloody, serpentine hands. And the man, God. She was sobbing at this point, overcome with terror and trembling. My hands were icy and wet. I suddenly saw through him. He wasn't a man, wasn't anything. He was bestial, monstrous, like them, but hiding it all behind his face. He just stared at me with lifeless eyes as he beckoned me forward. And I couldn't, Father. I couldn't go. I knew I had to get out, and it seemed that I finally came to my senses. So I ran out into the darkness, out into this fog of nothingness, while everything in my mind told me that death was racing to catch me. She breathed, catching her breath, deep, laborious breaths. CK's face remained calm and cool. When did things become normal again? Sniffing, Lavender sought for words. I ran until I couldn't, and the fog was still so dense. In my mind and on the street, I just wandered and wandered. Before I knew it, I was just standing there. She pointed to the front of the shop with a trembling hand. Kelly, Father, I called that night. I hated myself for making that call with every fiber of my being, but I knew I had to. The next day and the next, every day I called the bishop's office, and every day it was just another message, and I felt like it was the same thing all over again. But then yesterday, I was a bit busy in the shop, and suddenly the feeling came over me, like eyes in the back of my head, just pure terror. And I looked outside, and he was there, across the street, just smiling, staring at me. I knew I had to tell Joseph to his face, or nothing was going to happen. Nothing was ever going to happen. No one was ever going to believe me. Joseph. My thoughts were confused and wild. She called the bishop by his first name. Who was this woman? She looked down at the floor, seeming to collapse in the exhaustion she had weaved for herself in telling the story. I believe you, Ezra. Gray and I both do, CK said with a soft smile, reaching forward to grab her hand. We sat for a moment as Lavender collected herself. I have him on video. She cleared her throat, standing up. From the security cameras. Will that help? Please, CK said. Nothing can hurt at this point. Lavender walked to the back of the shop, entering the door to her stockroom. CK and I were alone for a moment as we sat in silence. CK silently made the sign of the cross, praying something under his breath. I did as well, finally needing to ask what had been on my mind for some minutes. Ezra? I said softly. Kelly looked at me with that same pensive look as before. Yeah, her real name is Ezra. It's the name her parents gave her. The name I first met her by when she was a newborn. It's the name I baptized her with. I looked at him incredulously. Her family? CK looked changed. Not pensiveness, but genuine sorrow. Kid, sometimes... He cleared his throat and looked down at the floor, folding his storied hands together. In our work, there are times that you just can't save everyone. The door to the back room opened again as Lavender came out carrying a laptop. She set it on the counter. CK stood up, steadying himself on his cane as we both instinctively gathered around. This is from the first time he came in, she said, hitting play. It was a simple enough video, though silent. A man came in the store, his face obscured by the light, and approached the counter. He spoke with Lavender for a moment before she seemed to tell him to wait, and left to walk towards the back. Something about him, though, the build, the figure, CK leaned in, his face directly next to mine as we watched. I felt a sense of dread rise up inside me, and a cold sweat build up again. "Gray," CK said softly, his eyes never blinking as he watched. The man in the video then turned, not facing the stockroom, but looking directly into the camera. "Oh God," I whispered. CK yelled in anger, slamming his cane on the floor in frustration. On the screen, looking directly into the video feed, was a short, portly, middle-aged man. I recognized him in an instant. CK did too, and Lavender looked at both of us in shock. It was Dr. Mangrove. "Harold. His name was Harold?" I said to Lavender. She nodded yes, fear visible in her widening eyes. I looked at the screen again in disbelief. Harold seemed to peer directly into my eyes through the video. His face was as normal as when I'd first met him, but his eyes, you can always tell by the eyes. Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's story. I hope you've been enjoying the PadreGrey stories as much as I have. I feel like we have a ways to go before we see his work complete. So, I hope you've been enjoying him, because our Monday stories are probably going to encompass him for a while longer. If you haven't yet, I would highly recommend that you head over to A.S. Morrison's Wattpad account. He's such a great writer, I can't recommend him highly enough. If you've been enjoying the story half as much as I have, definitely thank Glenn Jenkins. This was his story recommendation, and it turned out great. Thanks, Glenn. This has been a really great series. Speaking of Glenn Jenkins, let's go ahead and thank our sponsors. Thanks to Leslie Lou Riddle and Janet for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributors. Thanks, guys. And thanks to Glenn Jenkins for being our Ghostwriter tier contributor. Thanks to all three of you. I really couldn't do the show without you. If you too would like to support the show, come on down to Patreon. For just $5 a month, arguably the cost of a daily Starbucks drink, you too can support the show and have your name read out at the end of every TikTok and every YouTube video that I make. As always, you can head to Amazon as well and buy a book. We've been reading Dark Vortex in our Wednesday stories, but I think we're almost ready for Dark Journeys, so if you want to go ahead and pick up that one, you'll be ready for our next series. You could also come and join our Ghostly Book Club tier. For just $10 a month, I send you a copy of my book anytime I put one out, so it's a pretty great deal. You get yourself a signed copy, and you get to keep up to date with my writing work, of which there will be 2 new ones this year, so look out for those. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.